The smell reached them before the guards set the trays down. A heavy, rich perfume of sizzling meat drifted through the air, carried across the rows of barbed wire and watchtowers. For the German women crowded inside that camp, the scent was almost unbearable in its familiarity and its strangeness. They had not smelled steak, real steak, marbled with fat and browned by fire, since before the war had swallowed their lives whole. Now, of all places, in the heart of enemy territory, they were being served something their families back home could only dream of. Eyes widened, hands froze in midair, and the silence that hung over the mess hall was louder than any shouted command. Hunger met disbelief in that single, charged moment. They had arrived expecting punishment, humiliation, perhaps even starvation. The stories they carried with them were shaped by rumor, tales of Soviet brutality, of prisoners vanishing into camps that never released them, of cruelty measured in crusts of bread. The barbed wire fencing around them seemed to promise nothing different. To be captured was to be reduced to a number, to be fed only enough to keep the body alive while the spirit withered. That was the script they thought they were entering. Yet the United States Army had written something else entirely. Instead of watery broth and hard crusts, plates now gleamed with meat that glistened under thin streams of grease, beside potatoes soft enough to crumble beneath a fork, and bread still warm in its center. It was not just food, it was a contradiction, a paradox served on tin trays. Some of the women lifted their forks cautiously, as though expecting a cruel trick. Others leaned closer, breathing in the aroma, their eyes darting to the guards for signs of mockery. A few whispered under their breath, muttering prayers or disbelief, while one young woman, no older than 20, pressed her fingers to her lips to stifle a laugh that sounded too close to weeping. 4 years, their bodies had grown leaner, their stomachs shrunk from rationing, their memories of comfort fading. Bread in wartime Germany had often been stretched with sawdust and ersatz fillers. Meat was a luxury reserved for those with power, and coffee, real coffee, was an impossible dream. Their families scraped by on turnips and watery soups, their children's ribs showing through thin shirts. And here, within fences meant to cage them, abundance appeared like an insult from fate, or perhaps a gift they were too proud to accept. The guards, mostly young Americans, watched the scene with a mixture of amusement and impatience. To them, it was routine. Rations were rations. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be fed according to the standards of the captor's own soldiers, and America had plenty to spare. Steak, potatoes, bread, this was not generosity, they believed, but regulation. Yet regulation alone could not explain the bewilderment on the prisoners' faces. To the women, every bite was theater, every flavor a reminder that the world beyond their homeland did not bend to the same laws of scarcity. One woman, her hair cropped short from lice and fatigue, finally pierced the steak with her fork. The juice bled across the tray, pooling against the bread. She raised it to her lips, and the hall seemed to hold its breath. The first chew was slow, mechanical. Then her shoulders trembled, and her eyes closed. She was not eating in an American camp anymore. She was back at her mother's table, the clatter of dishes and the warmth of Sunday dinner filling her senses. For a flicker of time, the war vanished. That was the irony. The enemy had delivered them back to memories their own nation could not provide. In the act of swallowing, they confronted the impossible. To be captive and yet treated with a kind of careless dignity, to be enemies and yet nourished as though they belonged. The conflict inside them deepened. Gratitude fought with suspicion, and guilt gnawed sharper than hunger. How could they savor what their children could not taste? How could they allow themselves to feel relief while their families withered in ruins? The room filled slowly with the sound of knives scraping trays, of chewing, of breaths drawn heavier with each bite. A few began to eat eagerly, abandoning hesitation, their hunger overriding pride. Others picked cautiously, as though each mouthful betrayed something sacred. The taste of the food was too vivid, too real. It stripped away their defenses. They had been trained to expect cruelty, and yet here was abundance, unearned and unsettling. The irony thickened as the meal went on. A few laughed softly, shaking their heads, muttering that this must be some elaborate American trick. One joked that they were being fattened like geese, destined for some darker fate. But the joke carried a nervous edge. Each mouthful blurred the line between fear and comfort, between captivity and humanity. The steak was not just food, it was a question without words, a mirror forcing them to see their enemy in a different light. When the trays were finally cleared, a hush lingered. The taste still clung to their tongues, heavy and confusing. Some felt almost ashamed to have eaten so much. Others longed secretly for the next meal. The guards herded them back to their barracks, boots crunching on gravel, rifles slung casually, as though none of it mattered. Yet for the prisoners, something had shifted irreversibly. They had stepped into a world where the enemy fed them more richly than their homeland ever had, where captivity carried flavors sweeter than freedom. And though they did not yet realize it, that first bite was only the beginning. The barbed wire would hold them, yes, but the meal served within it would unravel truths far more dangerous than any prison escape. For what they tasted that night was not merely steak. It was the unsettling possibility that their enemy's world, for all its fences and guards, might be freer, fuller, and more abundant than their own. The first chew had opened a door they could not yet close, and what waited on the other side was stranger still. The kitchens of the American camps were not what the German women had expected. They had imagined shadowy rooms where watery broth simmered in dented pots, where scraps were ladled out with cold indifference. Instead, behind the barbed wire, they discovered sprawling kitchens that pulsed with the rhythm of order and excess. Vast stoves hissed with steam, knives clattered against cutting boards, and the smell of roasted meats, fried potatoes, and freshly baked bread drifted across the compound like a taunt from another universe. For the women, each day in that mess hall brought a new shock. Breakfast could mean stacks of pancakes slicked with syrup or eggs scrambled with onions and ham. Lunch might be thick slices of bread slathered with butter, bowls of hearty stew, or, on some days, the soft chew of pasta tangled in tomato sauce. And then came dinners, full meals that might end with a wedge of apple pie, its crust golden, sugar dusted across the top as if war itself had forgotten to cross the Atlantic. What they had thought was a one-time gesture, the steak that stunned them on their first night, proved instead to be routine. Meals were not occasional luxuries, but daily performances of plenty. Some tried to refuse at first, clinging to a pride that resisted nourishment from their enemies' hands. They picked at their trays, eating only enough to quiet the ache of hunger. But the food wore them down, the steady cadence of abundance grinding against their resistance. One could not resist forever the pull of fresh bread still warm in the middle, or the comfort of potatoes whipped smooth with butter. Hunger was an enemy greater than pride, and slowly, quietly, even the most defiant surrendered. The camp's guards, many of them little older than the prisoners themselves, noticed the change. They saw the women who once scowled at their trays now reaching eagerly for second helpings of bread. They overheard laughter in the lines, an uneasy laughter, born from the absurdity of prisoners joking about whether the cooks had used too much salt in the soup. In the strange theater of captivity, meals became rehearsals in contradiction. The captives both fed and humbled, the guards both enforcers and providers. Behind those meals lay numbers as vast as the farms that produced them. Each German prisoner received nearly the same ration as an American soldier: meat, bread, butter, vegetables, coffee, sugar. By 1944, when German cities were reduced to rubble and German families scoured fields for turnips, America's farms overflowed. Wheat rolled in endless golden seas across Kansas, beef cattle stampeded through Texas ranges, and coffee ships docked at American ports by the ton. In 1 year, the camps consumed millions of pounds of flour, thousands of tons of potatoes, and more meat than many of the prisoners had seen in half a decade. The abundance was statistical as much as sensory, and each bite carried with it the arithmetic of victory. But to the women inside, the statistics were experienced in more intimate ways. One remembered the first time she bit into a dinner roll so soft she nearly cried, recalling how her younger brother back home gnawed on loaves laced with sawdust. Another could not stop staring at the glistening butter set on tables in small bowls, remembering how her mother rationed margarine in thin slices, saving it for Sundays. The irony was sharp, almost cruel. They were prisoners, yet here they ate better than their own children. Some whispered of home with voices caught between longing and guilt. At night, lying on their bunks, they spoke of the meals they wished they could send through the wires: loaves of bread for their families, cups of coffee for their fathers, even bones to boil for broth. The food filled their bellies, yes, but it also hollowed their hearts. Abundance in captivity reminded them daily of absence in freedom. Still, humor sprouted in the cracks of contradiction. A few women joked that they had been captured by chefs rather than soldiers. One teased another about gaining weight in captivity, quipping that she might not fit through the camp gate when release finally came. These jokes carried nervous laughter, yet they also revealed how the meals shifted the rhythm of life inside. Hunger no longer defined their days. Instead, meals became landmarks of time, strange comforts marking their passage through imprisonment. The kitchens themselves grew into symbols. The clang of pots, the hiss of frying pans, the smell of yeast rising into bread, they were reminders of a country that seemed to have no end to its bounty. To the women, each spoonful was proof of American excess, a silent weapon more potent than bullets. For if an enemy could feed its prisoners this well, what did that say about the world beyond the barbed wire? The conflict grew quieter but sharper. Gratitude bloomed uninvited, yet alongside it came shame. Each bite carried a shadow of guilt that could not be swallowed away. Their families starved while they, the defeated, dined. It was an unresolvable irony, a torment stitched invisibly into every tray that clattered across the mess hall. By the end of their first month, the shock of abundance no longer froze them at the table, yet it never lost its strangeness. The camp kitchens remained places of wonder and unease, where the generosity of the enemy exposed the poverty of their own homeland. Meals blurred the lines of identity. Were they captives, enemies, or unwilling guests at a table set by history itself? And as the weeks turned into months, they began to realize that the food was more than sustenance. It was instruction, persuasion by flavor, a slow education in the power of plenty. Each dish carried not just calories but meaning, an unspoken message that echoed beyond the fences. For steak and bread and coffee were not merely meals behind barbed wire, they were arguments on a plate. And soon, the prisoners would understand that the kitchens of their captivity were feeding something far more dangerous than their hunger. A plate of food can be as sharp as a weapon, and in the American camps it was wielded with quiet precision. The German women, who had braced themselves for chains and cruelty, instead found their captors disarming them with coffee, butter, and cuts of meat that glistened under fluorescent light. Forks and knives became instruments not just of nourishment but of persuasion. Each bite was a lesson, each meal a silent lecture in a language they had not expected to learn. The Americans understood something elemental. A full stomach could soften suspicion, and a generous meal could speak louder than any propaganda leaflet dropped from the sky. Yet to the women, that generosity was its own battlefield. Many sat at the tables with eyes cast downward, eating slowly, as though the food itself might expose their divided loyalties. They felt the pull of gratitude rising in their throats even as their hearts clenched with guilt. Letters from home, when they arrived, painted a different picture. Mothers queuing for hours for bread, children fainting from hunger in schoolrooms, neighbors boiling nettles to survive. To read those words and then sit down to steak was almost unbearable. Some prisoners confessed in hushed tones that they wept quietly into their dinner rolls, the taste of salt not only from butter but from their own tears. America's abundance was not accidental, nor was its display. The United States government had calculated that prisoners well-fed and well-treated would become inadvertent witnesses, carrying stories of American wealth and fairness back to Europe when the war ended. Feeding enemies lavishly was not merely kindness, it was policy, a form of psychological warfare designed to undermine the myths of Nazi superiority. By 1945, over 371,000 German POWs were scattered across the United States, and every one of them was a potential messenger. Food, in this equation, became propaganda plated neatly on tin trays. The cost was staggering. Tons of flour were milled into bread, millions of pounds of beef roasted or stewed, endless rivers of coffee poured steaming into metal mugs. Each prisoner's daily rations nearly matched that of an American soldier, an indulgence when compared to the collapse of food supplies across Europe. Where the average German civilian might scrape by on 1,200 calories a day, POWs in America consumed nearly double. In some camps, the prisoners even organized feasts on holidays, complete with cakes, sausages, and, when supplies allowed, beer. It was captivity, but captivity garnished with abundance. Among the women, reactions varied. Some surrendered quickly to the pleasures of taste, their initial caution dissolved in the rhythm of regular meals. Others fought against it, clinging to bitterness, insisting that abundance offered by the enemy was poisoned by humiliation. One woman declared that she could feel herself being seduced by the very bread she ate, that each chew threatened to soften her anger. Another claimed that the steak tasted like betrayal, though she finished every last bite. These contradictions gnawed at them as surely as hunger once had. But there was another layer too. Humor, born of absurdity. A few joked that the Americans were trying to make them too heavy to escape. Others teased one another about gaining hips and cheeks they hadn't seen since before the war. "Better to be a fat prisoner than a starving patriot," one muttered with a crooked grin, though the laughter that followed was edged with unease. For humor was only a thin veil stretched across a deeper truth. They were learning that the enemy's world was not the bleak place Nazi propaganda had promised. Around the tables, conversations shifted subtly. They spoke of the taste of coffee, of the strangeness of canned fruit, of the sweetness of chocolate that melted on the tongue. These were not just meals. They were glimpses into another reality, a parallel world where even prisoners dined better than free citizens across the ocean. Every forkful chipped away at the walls of ideology, forcing them to reconcile propaganda with what their senses told them was undeniable. The Americans knew it, too. Guards often delivered the meals with casual indifference, but behind that routine was strategy. Food was theater, and the prisoners were the audience. Every bite became a whisper. This is what freedom tastes like. This is what victory feels like. The irony was ruthless. Captivity used to advertise liberty. Still, conflict simmered within the women. Gratitude rose alongside shame. Some tried to imagine the faces of their children as they chewed, to summon guilt strong enough to resist the pull of comfort. Others abandoned resistance, surrendering to the relief of fullness, admitting privately that the meals softened their fear. Yet all of them, whether defiant or resigned, could not escape the lesson being taught. The enemy was not starving, the enemy was feasting. And they, as prisoners, were invited to taste it. The paradox cut deeper with each passing month. To eat was to live, but to live well in captivity was to question everything they had believed about their homeland, about their enemy, about the war itself. The meals became battlegrounds of conscience, and the knives and forks in their hands felt heavier than they should have. Tools for eating, yes, but also instruments forcing them to carve apart their own certainties. By the time spring rolled across the camp fences, the shock of abundance no longer froze them, but it had not lost its power. They carried the memory of every meal like a secret weight, a burden they could neither deny nor share without shame. And though laughter sometimes bubbled up in the mess hall, it was fragile, a nervous crack in the mask of endurance. For the Americans, the plan was working. For the prisoners, the taste of steak and bread was no longer just food. It was dissonance, guilt, temptation, revelation. Every tray cleared was another small defeat for the narratives they had been raised on. The propaganda did not arrive in speeches or slogans, but in butter melting across bread, in the bitter warmth of coffee swallowed at dawn. And soon, as weeks became months, the women would realize that the meals were reshaping them from within, feeding not only their bodies but their doubts. What they thought was survival was in truth a quiet transformation, one that would haunt them long after the barbed wire was gone. Years later, when the women spoke of their time in America, it was never the fences or the guards that filled their memories first. It was the food. The taste of it lingered long after the sting of captivity faded, like a stubborn echo lodged in the back of the throat. For some, the memory was warm, almost tender, a reminder that life could surprise even in its darkest chapters. For others, it was a wound, sharp with guilt, because every bite they had swallowed behind barbed wire had been one their families back home never tasted. In either case, the meals had outlived the war, haunting them with flavors too vivid to forget. The feast had not been only about sustenance. It had been theater, ideology, and revelation. Each tray of steak, bread, and butter had chipped at the certainties they once carried like armor. The camp was supposed to be a place of humiliation, but instead it had given them a glimpse of abundance that unsettled everything they thought they knew about power. Food became proof of a world that operated on rules different from the harsh arithmetic of scarcity they had grown up with. It was not only that America had more, it was that America displayed it without hesitation, as if generosity itself were a declaration of strength. One woman, recalling her first sip of real coffee, admitted decades later that she had cried quietly into her mug. Not because it tasted good, though it did, but because it tasted like possibility, like something forbidden that had slipped past the fences of ideology. Another remembered the first slice of apple pie placed before her, the cinnamon sweet and sharp, the crust delicate and buttery. She confessed that she hesitated for long minutes before tasting it, as though consuming it might erase the lines between enemy and friend. When she finally did, she told her children years later, It was the first time she understood that defeat could carry a strange kind of mercy. The conflict of those meals never left them. Gratitude and shame walked hand in hand, inseparable companions in memory. They had eaten well while their brothers and husbands starved on the Eastern Front, while their mothers bartered heirlooms for turnips, while children in their own villages wasted away. That contrast carved itself into their conscience. Some admitted they felt like traitors when they remembered their own full bellies. Others argued that survival itself was its own form of resistance, that to endure meant to carry stories of the truth back across the ocean. In either case, the memory of food became more than nostalgia. It was a reckoning with who they had been and who they had become. The Americans had intended it as propaganda, but propaganda does not always move in straight lines. The women did not emerge as converts, waving flags of democracy. Yet they carried home a dangerous seed, the realization that another world existed, one where even prisoners could eat like queens. That seed sprouted quietly in post-war kitchens, in whispered comparisons, in the way they described the taste of coffee to neighbors who had never known it. It was a subtle form of contagion, carried not in speeches but in memories of butter and bread. In their later lives, many of them told their children and grandchildren stories of those meals. Some told them proudly, as evidence of having endured an experience both strange and humanizing. Others confessed with hesitation, as if afraid to admit they had been treated kindly by the enemy. But the stories came anyway, told in kitchens where pots boiled and bread baked, in dining rooms where families leaned in to listen. The food became folklore, handed down like an heirloom, its symbolism shifting with each telling. The paradox lay at the heart of it all. They were prisoners, and yet they were nourished. They were enemies, and yet they were cared for. That paradox refused to fade. For some, it softened their bitterness toward America. For others, it sharpened their disillusionment with a regime that had promised them greatness yet left their families starving. And for all, it became a reminder that history is rarely what propaganda claims it to be. Sometimes, truth is tasted rather than told. The feast inside those camps became a metaphor greater than itself. It was not just steak behind barbed wire, it was the collision of two worlds, one built on scarcity and control, the other on plenty and display. The prisoners had walked into captivity expecting deprivation, but instead they encountered a theater of abundance that unsettled their certainties. It was as though every slice of bread handed across the counter was an invitation to imagine a different future, even if they dared not accept it at the time. And so, the memory endured. Long after the barbed wire had been cut down, long after uniforms were shed and peace treaties signed, the women carried with them the strange ghost of those meals. In their minds, the clang of tin trays still echoed, the steam of potatoes still rose, the sweetness of pie still lingered. The food had become more than food. It was a symbol, a riddle, a reminder that even in war, humanity can arrive on a plate. But memory has a way of sharpening contradictions rather than resolving them. Some women, in their final years, admitted they had never truly reconciled with what they had eaten. They had lived full lives, raised families, built homes, and yet whenever the smell of steak filled their kitchens, they were carried back behind barbed wire, where the enemy had fed them better than their own nation ever had. The taste was forever bittersweet, rich with nourishment but salted with guilt. In the end, the meals were not only about survival. They were about power, about perception, about the way a nation chose to define itself not just through weapons but through bread and butter. The steak that once sizzled on their plates had become something larger, a slice of democracy, a piece of ideology served medium rare. And though time weathered their bodies and dulled their memories, the taste endured, stubborn and luminous, a flavor that carried with it a question they never fully answered. For what they had swallowed behind barbed wire was not just food, it was a glimpse of a different world, and that glimpse would follow them for the rest of their lives. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.